What if you could help others to find the power to heal themselves? Physically, emotionally, and spiritually.
When I started teaching my classes, it was in 2002, and I was just doing the past life regressions and contacting the subconscious part. But then as the time went on and we found how powerful this was and what we could do with it, a lot of the students began saying, you know, advanced past life regression doesn't really tell what it's all about. This is so much more than that. We think you should change the name. So it was a few years ago we decided to change the name to quantum healing hypnosis technique. And this is the healing technique that we've now been teaching it, well, since 2002, that's 12 years.
What if you could time travel with them? Visit mythical places or angelic realms, other worlds, other galaxies. Help others to speak to their higher selves. You can. Dolores has taught thousands of people from across the world how to use QHHT, and now you can learn her method by going directly to dolorescannon.com. And don't forget to mention the discount code MORETALKS.
Established over 100 years ago, Watkins Books is one of the world's oldest and leading independent bookshops specializing in esoterica. We have the widest selection of esoteric books in the UK, and our friendly and knowledgeable staff are here to assist you in a unique ambience of our shop. So come and visit us in the heart of London as we're open every day.
The More Show is supported by Mindscape, Paranormal and UFO Matrix magazines, available for download on all major digital platforms. The comments and views expressed on The More Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the view of Kevin Moore, The More Show, or this radio station and its affiliate or sponsors. This show is for entertainment purposes only.
Broadcasting from the UK and across the world online. You're now watching the UK's only alternative late night talk show, and I'm your host, Kevin Moore. For the next hour, I'll be covering subjects that will open up your mind and provide you with information you may have never heard before. On today's show, I'm joined with Thomas Hatsis, who is an historian of witchcraft, magic, Western religions, and contemporary psychedelica. He was head historical research assistant at Queen's College for the 2010 textbook, teaching world history as mystery. He has taught history at Pioneer Pacific College and also teaches roller derby all over the world, and has articles published in the Psychedelic journals and Psychedelic America. He lives in New York and joins us to discuss his book, The Witch's Ointment, The Secret History of Psychedelic Magic.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you on today, Thomas. Very interesting book. When I first saw the book cover, I was like, wow, what is this about? The Witch's Ointment. But before we get into any of that, what is your background then in terms of approaching this book?
I really just lived in my car and traveled all over the United States and in the UK as well, although not in my car in the UK, and went to different archives and dug up the sources, and some of them were translated into English for the first time. That was it. It was not I have a master's degree in history from Queen's College in New York, and I was going to go for my PhD. I was going to go to UC Berkeley, but as we say in the derby world, can't have derby. So I ended up really driving around, being what they call a derby gypsy, going from place to place, teaching roller derby for a couple of bucks and a place to sleep, and going to the local university if they had like an archive or something. For example, I went to Tulane in New Orleans, Stanford, just outside of San Francisco, and a whole bunch of places in between.
Right, okay. But what led you into the interest to do this for your sort of final project on your masters? And it's called for the masters. Is it your thesis or?
Oh, this had nothing to do with my master's thesis.
Okay.
I was just saying, like, my background education-wise. I got my master's, was going to go for my PhD, but decided to travel the world and write this kind of book instead, and that was it.
Right. And is that still something that you may do with your PhD?
Maybe. It's I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a big commitment, isn't it? Big commitment. Yeah.
It's
well
a huge
worth
commitment.
it. Yes, absolutely. Well, okay, then what led you to write? Where's your interest in this subject, and what led you to write it then?
My interest is more in psychedelic and entheogenic history, and the witch's ointment just hadn't been treated at all by any kind of scholarly approach. So I just was like, all right, somebody has to fill this void.
So, okay, straight to it then. What is the witch's ointment?
The witch's ointment is a kind of reefer madness hysteria of the 15th century. When it was created, it grew out of what I believe it grew out of were these ointments used for entheogenic goddess worship, in a sense. They were really entheogens, and people were using them to fall into trances, to meet up with different like a kind of archetypical great mother. Now, when certain church authorities heard about this, they obviously didn't like it, because to them, there are only two forces in the universe. There's, God on one side, and there's the devil on the other. So if it's not God, it's automatically defaulted to the devil. So the witch's ointment represents that stereotype of an entheogenic ointment.
Okay.
It's
Now,
complicated. It's very complicated.
It's absolutely. It wasn't a straight read in some parts of it as well, because even the way that you've chaptered it is quite different.
Yes, because the witch's ointment was part of this larger witch stereotype, and you had there were so many different ingredients that fed into this stereotype, and that's what each of the chapters are. So, for example, folk beliefs about night travelers and night flying, that's chapter 2, because those folk beliefs fed into the stereotype. Also, theological fears about what heretics were doing fed into the stereotype. That's chapter 3. Chapter 4 deals with the different substances that were used and the different recipes that were available for people to use. Chapter 5 is just the different kinds of magic. Chapter 6 is how the people actually used these ointments on themselves. 7 shows how inquisitorial procedure, otherwise known as torture, is what turned in the confession rooms these entheogenic ointments into this diabolical witch's ointment.
Wow. Okay, so this has given you a complete understanding of European witchcraft, then, in a sense.
Not European witchcraft, just how this particular ointment came about, because you don't hear about it until the 1430s, really. The early 1400s, 1420s, 14 teens or so. Before that, you don't hear anything about these kinds of ointments because nobody cared. There were private experiences. When somebody brought a witch to trial, it was because there was perceived harm that witch had caused. Well, what harm is there if a witch is falling into a trance to worship a fertility goddess? Well, none. So you're not going to find those in the trials until the church determined that this was what they called a crimen animae, a crime of the spirit. And then you start to see it. So what I tried to do in the book was show that pivotal moment, like the decades leading up, and then that pivotal moment when it all turned over and then went into this other kind of trajectory that we today call the witch's ointment.
Wow, a crime of the spirit. You just can't imagine that, can you? You know, to be put through that kind of trial, in a sense. The crime of what we look at nowadays as being part of the sort of New Age movement, in a sense. And these people were killed in their hundreds and thousands for it, weren't they? In a sense, thousands, I would say, were killed in the witch trials.
Yeah, not hundreds of thousands, but certainly thousands. And the majority of people burned for witchcraft were not really witches. That had to do with, again, the witch stereotype, and part of that witch stereotype involved a collective worship of Satan. So when they brought a real deal, sorceress, or I think they were more of shamans than anything else, when they brought one of these women in for interrogation, they would, say, like, who are you working with? And she wasn't working with anyone, because she wasn't really flying to worship the devil, but turn of the thumb screw, break out the red hot pokers, and that person's going to say whatever you want them to say. So then this shaman starts name dropping all these other people. And it's just like, why? Well, to get the torture to stop. So then they bring in these other people and say, okay, well, we know, your name has been dropped. Who are you working with? And these people are saying, what do you mean? I'm not a witch. I'm not anything. Turn those thumb screws. Okay, it was Kevin Moore. He's also involved. So then Kevin Moore is now brought into trial. And now all of these people are now burned for witchcraft because it was believed that witches worshiped the devil collectively. But they didn't. Or at least there's no evidence that they did, I should say.
We've come a long way since then, and some religions are still have their moments, shall we say, in different cultures right now. But we can't be too hard on other cultures, in a sense, for what existed in Europe, where I'm sat now. Crazy.
Yeah. It's a shame, because people really did believe it. And that's what the great tragedy of it is, that they weren't, it's hard to give a pass to these inquisitors. And I'm certainly not a person that's going to do that. But at the same time, if you truly believe that there are witches and that they worship collectively, and they really did believe it. And the other thing is that these women who were shamans and were seers and sorceresses, they also did believe in the efficacy of their powers. There just wasn't anything evil about it. No. It was the church that determined that there was something evil about it.
Yes, absolutely. And, they talked about supposedly lubricating their broomsticks and, fueled mystic journeys and hallucinogenic night flights.
Yeah, that was, it's odd, because the best records we have don't talk about rubbing them on the brooms or fence posts or rakes. Even a stove at one point was said to, people would rub ointments on that. But, the best records we have, and what makes them so crucial, is that they say that the ointment was applied to the flesh.
Yeah. So give us a scenario then where who would these ointments be supplied to, and what were some of the general uses of them as well?
Sure. Well, the ointments for this kind of entheogenic fertility goddess worship was quite sporadic before the witch stereotype. In a sense, the church popularized the idea. So you don't really see too many people using it for that kind of purpose. What you do see people using them for are things like to bewitch a pesky neighbor. For example, if somebody's kind of bothering you, you slip either a drug in their food, or you as surreptitiously as possible. I don't know how you could do it so secretly, but maybe just rub them with a quick ointment or something, and when the drug starts to hit, you'd say an incantation over them, and they would think that you had that power over them. So that was a popular way that they were used. Although, again, more in a potion or a powder form. As far as like the actual entheogenic ointment itself, that seems not to have been vended so much for private use, or at least there isn't really any evidence that it was. That seems to be kind of this shamanist would sell you some kind of potion or a powder or something to bewitch someone or to enchant somebody, or even just as aphrodisiacs, something like today we would call ecstasy. And then they would use those same drugs on themselves for actual spiritual worship. And it all depended on the mindset. They would say different incantations over it. They would have different rituals, and that would give them a different outcome.
Would you say then that some of these witches were kind of what we could call now modern day healers?
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly what they were.
Yeah, it's funny. I speak to some of these healers, and they tell me that they had past lives. They're sure they had past lives as a witches, and that they were burned at the stake. Oh. And I don't know if you've come across anyone that's ever talked about having a past life, but on my program we get a few people that have come in with that, and it's just interesting that that nowadays they're modern healers, and yet they had these they believe that they were previously some time ago witches.
Yeah, exactly. I've run into some people that claim that they've had past lives. It's not really my area. I don't really know much about that though.
No,
I'm very ignorant in that area.
Well, I'm just bringing it up because of where I was just taking that question with the modern day healers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now your book it opens up with a famous sorcerer of the day, if I can use that word. I can't pronounce the name. I'm not going to bother. I'll let you pronounce the proper pronunciation of it.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, I mispronounced her name for about 4 or 5 years until I spoke to I pronounced it as Matthew Chia, and then I spoke to a professor at Boston College, Franco Mormando, who wrote this great book called The Preacher's Demons, and I said Matthew Chia over the phone, and he just started laughing, and he said, "Ha ha ha ha, Matucha." So that's how it's pronounced. It's Matucha de Francesca Lastriga de Casa Ripabianca. It means, Matucha means darling little female Matthew. Her parents apparently named her after Matthew, as in the Gospel of Matthew. They just feminized it. But she's very important to the history, not only of the witch's ointment, but the actual witch stereotype, because in her trial record, you can see the forcing of her to say that this was the devil's doing. The first part of the record starts off with all these kinds of things like love magic, trying to get people, either break up a wedding for one person or get another person to love another, or she would bewitch people. She was one of her most popular spells. I was saying before that people would sell these bewitching drugs to people. She sold a lot of those to abused wives, that they would sneak the drugs in their husband's food and make them behave later on. But you can actually watch, after all of that, the forcing of this witch stereotype into her confession. It's very, it's sad. Yes. Above all else. It's heartbreaking. But it is a very important window for the modern historian, because you can watch it happen in her trial record.
And it's incredible, isn't it, that those trial records still exist?
Oh yeah, people they kept all those records. Some are lost, of course, some don't make it down, but the commune de Todi in Italy, where they're preserved, it's been preserved there. I think for centuries, since the 1400s, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it's incredible though, isn't it? That you can, that they're still there, and you can get access to them, and it's great that you've done that and put the time into putting this book together, because I'm guessing that this book took its time to collect all the data.
Yeah, I spent about 9 years researching and writing it.
Wow, 9 years! Oh my gosh! Did you ever think you was going to finish it?
Yeah, because I'm that kind of person. I finish things I start.
With some of the ointments, what were some of the various ointments then?
What were in like what were they used for, or what was in them?
Well, some of the what was in them, and some of the because in chapter 4 you talk about the various
Yes.
ointments. Yeah.
Yeah, most of them were just medical ointments in the same sense that, like LSD started off as a medical drug. Cannabis and opium started off as medical drugs. All of these ointments were by and large medical ointments, but you would just maybe change one ingredient or two for symbolic reasons. But the really the whole range of them come from medical texts mostly.
And even back then, they had that knowledge.
Oh yeah, I mean that was actually one of the things that I was very surprised to learn is we have this, or at least I had this concept that all information was blacked out, and people called the time leading up to this the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
No, there people still wrote and passed down information. It's all there. I think that, I mean, myself included, a lot of us just don't take the time to check.
Yeah. That is pretty incredible. And are any of these ointments in a different form nowadays, in a sense, or?
There's a oh, what's her name? Sarah Lawless, who's lives up in Vancouver, Canada, I believe. She actually does make authentic witches ointments with like belladonna in them, and I don't know what else she puts in them. But so there are still witches making these ointments.
And in this process, have you met any? Put the healers to one side, but have you met any modern day witches?
Oh yeah, most of my friends are. I have a lot of friends that are modern day witches.
Right. Okay. That's
the
interesting.
young lady I'm seeing right now is a modern day witch.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And but that wasn't. You've not met through the process of writing the book, or?
No, I met mostly scholars of witchcraft and magic writing the book. That was who I spoke to. I wanted to really give this a very academic treatment.
Sure.
When I spoke to, for example, a singer in a band I used to be in who was also a witch, what she thought about it, she had a lot of interesting ideas about it, and with all respect to them, but they were mostly based on her opinions and not really the history of what it actually was. And I wanted to uncover the history of what was there.
Yeah, because you've approached this really, as probably we've said in the interview, as a historian.
Yes. Yeah, I wanted to give it a historical treatment. I didn't know what I was going to find when I first started digging, but once I started getting into the texts, and I had to teach myself Latin, so I learned Latin to be able to do it. Yeah, because I started going back up in time, trying to find like what is the beginning of this, and it got to the point where all the sources were in Latin. I was like, now I got to learn. I either got to end my research now, or I got to teach myself Latin. But I see things through to the end, so I taught myself. That's why it took 8 or 9 years, because I had to teach myself a language in order to write the book.
God, right? Okay, well that makes sense now. Yeah, well you're a clever guy to take all that on. Bloody hell!
No, I'm just tenacious. I'm not really all that clever. I'm just stubborn.
Well, it's got this wonderful book out there, which will now go towards as a history element. Towards the anyone that's researching or putting effort into looking at the what happened in sense of the witches. But I guess this is not dealing with some of the witch trials, though, is it, in a sense?
It does, but this is really what happened before the height of the witch trials. This is kind of the stuff that set the stage for the later, what they call the burning times. What I write about is what happened in the century before that, really set it up so that the burning times, scholars don't really use that word anymore, or that term anymore, burning times, although I think it's still very useful. But yeah, it doesn't really focus so much on any kind of, the larger trials of, later European history, or people have asked me about the Salem witch trials that happened over here in America.
Salem.
And it didn't really, the research didn't have to do with that. It has to do with a very specific time and place. And that time is the 1430s. And that place is the pretty much that alpine border between France, Germany, and Italy. That's where this all springs out of. In fact, I don't think I even touched British witchcraft at all. Because it had nothing to do with the formation of the witch's ointment. I mean, the idea, the concept certainly made it to the British Isles, as I'm sure many of your listeners and you know, but the actual formulation of the ointment has to do with a debate that erupted in the 1430s between theologians. They were trying to wonder, well, we know, quote unquote, we know that witches are flying to the devil in these mass droves, but no one has ever seen a witch fly. So how is it that we know, again, quote unquote, know that they're doing this, but no one's ever witnessed it? So they had this huge debate at the Council of Basel, wondering, well, what could it have been? And I think that some of the people there, men like Alonso Tostado, Johann Nitter, Wanda Torquemada, they brought up this idea that maybe they're using these ointments. You know, those ointments that they use for that kind of fertility goddess worship? And the first records we have of the ointments actually implicate that they were used for fertility goddess worship. And then later on, after the 1430s, after the Council of Basel, that's when you see that shift, that it's now satanic.
Isn't it? We can look back and just think how crazy, how absolutely insane were some of these people in charge of the major religion, Christianity at the time, to even think this way. But we did, didn't we?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate because it wasn't just the theologians. Like, for example, before the 1300s, I would say 1200s, 1300s, the majority of people that were executed for witchcraft were executed by their neighbors, not theologians, not inquisitors. They didn't care about this stuff. This was, common practices in villages and towns in the backwoods of Italy, Germany, France. They didn't care at all. It was only after the catastrophes of the 1300s, the Black Death, widespread famine, wars between these territories and nation states and things like that. That's when they tried to decide, well, it had more to do with changing views of the devil and the devil's presence in life. And that's what caused this stereotype.
Yeah, and I suppose one thing I'm missing out here is the control it had. Control. And that's, the major control at those times was, the church was the main religion of the time.
Yes, of course. But it was less to actually control, and that was there. I mean, absolutely. But they were trying to control it because they believed that this was what was causing all these calamities in life. Yeah. That's why they were trying to control it. I mean, the first injunctions against these different kinds of magic, are very light. I mean, if you were caught, for example, Burchard of Worms writes that if you were caught, doing these kinds of things, he's like, 3 days on bread and water. That's a pretty light sentence, because there weren't any of these huge catastrophes, and the witch theory and demonology wasn't so developed yet. So they gave pretty light sentences at the time, and then it's only about 3-4 centuries later with the larger catastrophes that were like they started burning people by the hundreds. In some cases, some towns in Germany, there was no one left. They burnt everybody.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So when doing this research, was it quite a dark book to form in the end, to put together?
It was. It was certainly, in a sense, yeah, because when you're reading these records and you're reading these chronicles, and it's there was a guy, for example, named Peter of Griers, who one night just was, he got up in the middle of the night, and wherever, perhaps he was going down to go to the bathroom or something, he ended up falling down the stairs. He ended up burning witches for that, saying that they must have caused him to fall down the stairs. And that was really upset. It's like, gee, come on. It's like, how arrogant are you that you can't even admit that, it's dark in these they're these narrow staircases that anybody could find. I was in the Duomo in Florence. I almost fell down the stairs, and there's lights in there now, because it's just, it's very, they're not easy to kind of descend and ascend. So it's just like, you just feel so bad. And I just felt so horrible for these poor, I mean, they're really just victims, what it comes down to.
Yes, of course they were. Of course they were. What have you taken? I mean, obviously this book's, you've gone through the process of writing this book. How has it changed you in a sense? What have you gained from it, would you say, the most?
What have I gained the most from it?
Yeah, in the sense of knowledge or your own journey, in a sense. I mean, it could be anything. It doesn't have to be related to the book, I suppose, but...
Sure. Well, I would say that, like most people, before I started my research, I thought that the information on Wikipedia on witches' ointments was accurate. I no longer think that. I would say that would be the biggest change, is that most of the articles you'll find online are really just not, they did not do any research at all in writing them, because the information is pretty horrendous.
Yeah.
That was a huge change. But I also, as a historian, I approach history scientifically, meaning I use the null hypothesis. I don't tend to go into studies with preconceived ideas, because then you're going to find exactly what you want to, whatever you can imagine, you'll find a way to butcher the evidence to make it fit. So I go into this stuff with a blank slate and just let the evidence build on itself. So there wasn't too much that I changed, because I didn't know much about it, and most people didn't really know too much about it, which is why I wanted to write a book about it, because there just wasn't really any accurate information out there, although I didn't know at the time, of course. But now that I've done the research and I've gone through the archives and I've pored over hundreds of trial records and hundreds of pages of demonological treatises and other sources, now I don't believe most of what has been written about it. I just don't.
What was some of the most surprising things you came across when researching this book and putting it together?
Sure. I would say actually the most surprising thing was not what I came across, but what I didn't come across. And that was the idea I'm sure you're familiar with, and I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, the idea that witches rubbed the hallucinogenic salves on brooms and masturbated with them. That idea was made up in 1973 by Michael Harner, and there is nothing anywhere in the historical record to actually demonstrate that people administered drugs that way. Every single record we have says that they used their fingers or a pessary. They did insert the ointments vaginally. Don't get me wrong, they absolutely did. They just didn't use brooms to do it. That was, again, if Michael Harner hadn't conjectured, and he offers it as conjecture in his essay, which is a great essay, and it was instrumental in kind of getting me started on this.
Right.
But other than that one sentence, before 1973, there is nothing in the records.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Again, it comes down to, because you've done the research yourself as well. You've gone down a completely different path where it's not hearsay. You've gone directly to the source.
Yeah, and also on that, no other historian of medieval magic and witchcraft has ever come across any record at all of this ever going on. The other thing that I'd say that was there that I was surprised and was really cool to find out was that I thought that flying ointments and entheogenic ointments were the same thing. There were flying ointments that had nothing to do with entheogenic purposes. There were entheogenic ointments that had nothing to do with flying, and there were entheogenic flying ointments. So you actually have all three, and I document them in the book. But as far as the other thing with the masturbating with the broomstick thing, that just doesn't appear anywhere, and I'd be very happy to be proven wrong on that, but no one has been able to produce a solitary primary record that shows anybody ever administering drugs that way.
Yeah, well, you've done the research. Do you know what I mean? So no one can take that away from you. So absolutely, well, that's interesting. That's very interesting.
I hope someone does take it away. I hope somebody comes up with a record. I would be so psyched, Kevin, to be proved wrong there. Like, I don't mind being proved wrong. Like, I want to know. I don't want to be right. I want to know. So if somebody does do that and they're like, wait, this guy, he looked over this record, Show me. I'd love to see it.
Well, I doubt that's going to happen because you've had to give it 9 years as well of traveling all over the place, and I'm guessing a lot of money to write this book as well. Because it costs, doesn't it, to get around and to go to the source. It's not like you say, you can't just go on the internet and communicate with people to get their input on what happened at the time. I mean, this is historic records. So, well, okay, you've got some terms in your book as well. For example, classical formulation of the witch. Now, for people who read your book, what does that mean?
That is the witch stereotype. That is the witch of popular imagination. Usually a woman, but sometimes a man, but more often a woman who flies on a broom that she has masturbated with or whatever. Although that's actually not even part of the classical witch. I shouldn't say that. That's more popular imagination today. But the classical witch is just this idea that these wise women, these shamans, were actually flying to the devil to worship him and fornicate with demons and eat children and drink blood, and that was the stereotypical witch. And once you were accused of witchcraft, it was very difficult to avoid having that stereotype thrust on you.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you say, I mean, once you've been accused of it, I mean, as well, and then you're taken for torture. I mean, as you've said previously, when you're under some horrific stuff like that, you will say anything for the pain to stop.
Yeah, exactly. That's why torture doesn't work. And I mean, even today we talk about there's the should we use torture, in our whatever war against terror? Well, no, because first of all, because it's immoral. Second of all, because the information is going to be junk, because they're going to say anything to get you to stop the torture.
Of course, man. Of course. Were there any films that you watched as well that were of any influence to you for your research? I mean, that's probably a bit of a crazy question, but I just wonder, did you go as far as that to look at what other people had, put down on video? There's
an old German movie. I forget the title. It's something Hexen something, I think. I couldn't get my hand on it to see the whole thing. I didn't really look to any movies at all, because most movies would be based on the popular notion of what a witch was, not what the historical witch actually was. And I think it's a disservice to throw our modern ideas onto people of the past. It's like, do we want to know what these people were really doing? Or do we want to satisfy our own egos and emotional needs and say, oh, they were masturbating with brooms that were covered in hallucinogenic salves? Do we want to know what they were actually doing, or do we want to pat ourselves on the back for being hip?
What were... yes, yeah, absolutely. With the psychedelic research then, with that angle with this work, were they using psychedelics as well to communicate to what they may call the other side, or the spirit world, heaven or home?
Yeah, that's what I mean by entheogenic. And when they were reaching out to fertility goddesses, that's really what I'm referring to, is that entheogenic use. They also did use it in some kinds of recreational psychedelic senses as well. Andres Laguna. Oh no, excuse me. Oh yeah, Andres Laguna and Gian Battista Della Porta both actually. I forget which of the gentlemen called it, but he called it a pleasant madness, and that's really what they called a psychedelic experience, was a pleasant madness.
Yeah.
So they did use them anyway.
I mean that spoken to a few people and watched some interviews on people who have done I think it's DMT, and when they've had these amazing experiences and communicated to, they've perceived that they've communicated to levels of reality that's beyond what we understand, and they've had almost a life review in a sense as well of where they're going with their life and maybe what they're supposed to be doing. Sure. Were there any sort of reported instances of this as well in your research?
Unfortunately, we don't really have the people, especially the shamans that were using these ointments for entheogenic reasons. Most of them were illiterate. So we don't really have anything from them. All we have are the records of people who watched them do it. And
Right.
unfortunately, we can't get behind the records. We can't get past that. And it's frustrating because it's like, what were they really doing? And we can speculate. And that's why I said at the beginning that it's my belief that they were using them for entheogenic reasons. And I go over in the book why I think that is, or why that was. Um, but at the end of the day, it's these a lot of the chroniclers, the theologians were writing about it. They were more focused on the idea that this is satanic, this is evil. They didn't really care so much to record why people were actually using them.
Now, obviously, with your book, how would you say your book fits in with the overall history of psychedelic research? Then,
Well, I think that it's funny because if you watch today, like on History Channel, Discovery Channel, any kind of drug history documentary, they do ancient Greece and Rome, and I think that Carl Ruck did great work with the rites of Eleusis and the entheogens that were used at Eleusis. I think Chris Bennett makes an amazing case for cannabis as soma, and you have all that in the past, like on these documentaries, and then all of a sudden, we're in the Victorian era with people using opium and hash and things like that. And it's like, whoa, 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 there's this whole span of history that was just completely overlooked, overlooked because really no one had treated it yet, which again was one of the reasons I wanted to see if there was anything to it. I didn't know what I was going to find when I first started, but I think what it does, I hope it does, is serve as a bridge between that ancient use, the now medieval, early modern use, and then modern use.
So then this sort of book does appeal then to people with an interest in herbal folk remedies, the relationship between alchemy and science, and the healings influenced in Western religions. Then I suppose
I hope so.
It's a whole mash of different strands, isn't it? In a sense,
it absolutely is, because it includes witchcraft history. It includes psychedelic history. It includes heretical history. It's all of that, because again, a lot of that has been very much overlooked. Although Richard Rudgley did some good work on it, I would say. But other than that, there really wasn't too much out there. There was a guy named Alexander Conklin, I believe is his name, who wrote a very short little, like, paper-thin volume called How Do Witches Fly? And I have it somewhere here, but it was he was a chemist, and the chapter on chemistry is really good, but the chapters on the history, in my opinion, leave a bit to be desired.
Yeah, and I suppose doing this book as well, it really, and because I've browsed through the book and read bits of it as well, it really makes you think about the way that your childhood was, in the sense that that witches are scary and evil and everything else, when actually it was quite the opposite.
Exactly, Kevin. It was the opposite. These were the people that you called upon when you were sick, because who could afford a university physician in those days? No, well, most villagers couldn't, so they would go to their local wise woman. And it's a shame, because these women served a very important function in society, and that they were eventually demonized as just being so evil when they were really so good. In fact, in some cases, they're known as the bonares, which means good doers, or those who walk well and do good. And it's like, so we knew that regular people saw them sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes regular people saw them as very beneficial to their society, and as helpers and healers. And unfortunately, then you had other people who thought that they were evil. Sure. And it wasn't always the theologians. It was sometimes neighbors. In fact, the few records we have from the 6, 7, 8, 900s, that was another interesting thing I found that I wasn't expecting to find, was that it was the theologians were actually saving these women from being burned at the stake by her neighbors, interestingly enough. And then later on, there was that changing view of what the devil was and the devil's powers. And now you have the theologians doing the opposite, trying to convince the people that these wise women are really witches. It wasn't straightforward. We tend to think sometimes that, the same rules applied in the 600s as applied in the 700s, as applied in the 1000s, 11 and 12. No, just like today, things change. And the views changed over time.
Well, you look at places like Iran, or I believe some places, maybe remote places in places like Indonesia and other such remote places. Well, obviously Iran's not remote, but just in general, where they, where witches are still killed, public executions. Killed by the villagers as well. There was a case in it. I'm sure it was Indonesia just recently. I think it was. Where some remote villagers had taken revenge on these women that were supposed to be witches. I don't know if you saw that case.
I didn't see that case, but that I am familiar with other cases of a similar vein. I didn't really delve too deeply into them for the book, but yeah, that does still happen today. In Central America as well, in Mexico, that happens sometimes. In certain parts of Africa, that happens.
Yes,
Indonesia as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really it's terrible. It's my heart goes out to these people.
And that's nowadays. I mean, it's we've still got a bit of a way to go, haven't we? But I mean, I think you do witches in general a great service with putting this historical records together and coming from that sense. Obviously, though, a lot of these witches, would they have been also classed as being a bit spiritual in a sense, looking at things from an alternative non-Christian perspective?
Oh, absolutely. There was a Sibylla de Fragugliati from northern Italy. She's in chapter 2. And Pierina de Bripio. They would absolutely, I mean, today we would call them New Agers. That's what they seem to have been like. They worshipped a fertility goddess named Madame Oriente. They would fall into trances to meet up with her. They were part of what was known as these different dead societies. They were societies of the dead. And they would go to different houses, and they would ransack houses that weren't well kept, and they would bless houses that were well kept. And we actually today, like when your parents, when you were young, they told you to clean your room, you got to clean. That's actually a residue from a time that Europeans believed that if you did not have a clean home, these different night wanderers were going to come in and ransack the place.
Isn't that incredible? Right. Okay. That's what that. Yeah.
That's actually where that comes from.
Yeah. So these, as you say, they were classed as New Agers. They were well ahead of their time in that perspective. Then.
Not that they were well ahead of their time. I'm just using a modern term to kind of anachronistically to as best I can to demonstrate what kind of people we're talking about.
Sure.
One of the problems is that we're stuck with 21st century terms to describe beliefs that have by and large been wiped out. So it's very difficult. I mean, I say that in some cases they were using these ointments for entheogenic purposes, but none of these people had ever heard of the word entheogen. So if you could go back and ask them, they would have no idea what you're talking about until they'd be like, no, just do it, and they would take you along. And actually, I write about a record of a guy who did take sample an ointment from a witch and thought he was flying through the air, and he didn't. It wasn't for entheogenic purposes. Earlier, I'd said that some of these flying ointments had nothing to do with entheogens. He would be an example of that, and the witch who gave it to him would be an example of somebody who used the ointments for magical purposes, but didn't really use it for an entheogenic purpose. Or maybe she
Okay.
did, and we just don't have a record of it.
Sure,
It's very
absolutely.
possible, you know.
Yeah. Oh well. Yeah. But especially with dealing with things as old as this is, in in terms of records that were kept. Well, you've done a great job. You really have. We've only sort of scratched on the surface right now, and the book's been coming up on the screen as well. Oh, and just your website as well for the audience.
That's arspsychedelia.com, ARSPSYCHEDELIA
Okay.
.com.
Excellent.
.com.
Right, excellent. Okay, well, that's just appearing up on the screen now. Obviously, doing this book, where is this work leading you, in a sense? I mean, we talked about you maybe potentially doing your PhD, if that feels right now. But where obviously this work's had a life of its own. The book's been been out now for a little bit. What would you like to do next?
I'm going to start, well, I leave for a book tour in 2 days, and just down the West Coast, into California, then back up again, and start saving up for to make it a documentary, actually. Not the whole book, but just the part that deals with the demonization of the sacred feminine. The entheogenic sacred feminine, I should say. I'm going to try to turn that into a short half hour, maybe an hour long documentary, and shop it around to places like, History Channel, Discovery Channel, things like that. That's the next step.
Excellent. That's very interesting. Funny you say. I actually thought that might, there might be something in there for TV, but I wasn't just too sure what part. But that's the line you're going to go down. Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. That's good. Okay. And what would you say then, if you could do with this book? How could you sum this book up as in the sense of what do you think the most important message it teaches us nowadays?
Don't believe everything you read on the internet. Do the work yourself, do the research, and I'm not saying that everything on the internet is incorrect, because there's a lot of very good information on the internet. Just be maybe a little discerning about it, because really anybody could put anything they want on the internet, and we're living in a time when narrative takes the place of fact. And I think that history matters. I think that facts matter, and so that, as actually the young lady I'm seeing said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So you might not have the same thing come up, but you might have a rhyme scheme. And just like you were saying earlier with the recent case from Indonesia, I mean, I'm hoping, and I don't, this is obviously very quixotic for me to say, but if one of those people would have read this book, maybe they wouldn't have executed that poor individual.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the article never said what happened to them. It was just, that they were caught, and it showed a picture of them being sort of handed over to the authorities in the village. So yeah, you are right. If it can do anything like that for any future generations as well, then that's got to be a good thing.
And also, I'd like to show, if possible, that the war on drugs is always constructed by authority figures with an agenda. Just like the reefer madness of the 1930s was just it was a political agenda, just like the LSD scares of the 60s, that was a political agenda. This was a theocratic agenda, the witch's ointment. And the more scholars can build on this, bring this kind of information to light, the more we're going to see hopefully more liberal and tolerant views of entheogens and even just recreational drug use. That would be good. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of people rotting away in jail. What, for smoking a joint? That's ridiculous. I have to pay for that. That's absurd. We all, our taxes pay for that?
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Absolutely. Well, and the laws are changing, aren't they? I mean,
They are. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm in Oregon now, and we just got recreational marijuana. So yeah, that's good. Colorado's got recreational. Washington has recreational. It seems to be the kind of thing where, at least in the states, it's going to happen state by state by state by state. So
it's incredible.
and,
I mean, that change is incredible. You've got to give it that.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's just that, like, for example, you have someone like, so the Native American church in the States, they can use peyote in their rituals. And I think that's excellent. However, if you have someone who also uses peyote in an entheogenic setting but isn't part of the church, that person's going to go to jail.
Yeah, makes no
Yeah,
sense.
it makes, like most U.S. drug laws, it makes no sense. It is at base hypocritical and just ridiculous. And I hope that this book, at least in a small way, contributes to that change and just say, hey, look, we know that this is just theocratic, authoritarian, political nonsense. So stop it. Absolutely. Well, life is always, if you're open to it, if you kind of just let yourself go into the wind, life is awesome. You never, you don't know how things are going to end up or where you're going to be. And I don't know. So far, the book is doing well, and
Good.
I'm enjoying the ride while it's here.
Excellent, man. Excellent. Well, Thomas Hatsis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Well, we've come to an end on tonight's show. Don't forget that you can listen and watch all our past interviews on the More Show's official YouTube channel. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new daily shows. You may also find out more on all past and upcoming guests on the show via themoreshow.co.uk, and do like us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates. So until next time, be safe.